Welcome everybody to our last session of our BU Virtual Conference 2023. My name's Geri, Sumpter. I'm the head of BU Delivery at Beyond Blue. You'll have seen me a few times across this conference, but I'm delighted to be here with other people you've seen a few times, but we'll all reintroduce ourselves for your benefit. So Tina.
Hi everyone, I'm Tina Martin. I'm the BU Strategic Relationships Manager at Headspace. Louis.
Hi everyone, I'm Louis Hamlyn-Harris. I'm the BU Executive Manager at Early Childhood Australia.
Hi everyone, I'm Karin Humphrey. I'm a BU Consultant at Early Childhood Australia.
And I'm Jen Berthold. I'm a BU Clinical Lead at Headspace in Victoria and Tasmania.
Fantastic, and it's so nice to be here with this amazing panel at the end of the day. And what we're going to do within our session is we're really going to reflect on some of the concepts that have been brought up through the conference, and also think about flourishing into the future with BU. There's been a lot that we've heard over the 2 days, a lot that's all fed our brains and our hearts and our souls, and we're going to try to reflect some of that back to you. We'd also love to hear some of your conversation. If there's any questions that you particularly like to ask us, so please feel free to pop those into the chat if something springs to mind. The first thing that we're going to talk about is around how well-being, resilience and inclusion are really important to thriving. And one of the things that I want to bring up first in this session is that yesterday we reflected a little bit in our wrap-up session on belonging. And there was actually a question that came through for Louis in that session, which was from Simon. And he was saying around a statistic that had been brought up by Dr. Kellyanne Allen in her session on belonging. And it was around a differentiated data point between sense of belonging within schools versus within early childhood. So, Louis, I thought I might give you that opportunity to reflect on that question.
Yeah, it's funny, Geri. I've had this question kind of batting around in my head all day, and I've just come out of a fantastic session with Amy Shine, and she was really talking about belonging. And she was talking about how important reciprocity is to belonging, this idea of a mutual connection. And one of the tips she shared for promoting belonging that she's found really powerful in her setting was to do with asking families to help, asking families to contribute. And it made me reflect on, it's so important to be able to receive, and sometimes we need to receive, and to be able to ask for help is so powerful. But I think if we reflect on some of the more meaningful experiences in our lives, often they're experiences of giving, right? And so I think we want to think about how we give people opportunities to give. I've got more thoughts about this, Karin, but I'm so curious your thoughts on maybe that disparity in those numbers, or some of the things you've heard about.
Yeah, and there's a lot I could add to the disparity, but I don't want to actually get into the sector demands and things like that. When you talked about getting information from families and supporting them around around the sense of belonging, I also feel like as educators, and this would go for those in schools as well, we spend a lot of time supporting the children to feel that sense of belonging. And we sometimes take away from our need to feel that sense of belonging as well. We're in an industry, in the early childhood sector, we're in an industry where we're working shifts. The centre is open for a long time. We can be in a standalone centre, so our notion of support or our availability for support isn't there. So it's about, if we're going to thrive, we really need to look at our own sense of belonging and where we get that from. And is it from ourselves? We need to look at that from an individual perspective. Is it from our team? Is it from our family outside? It's that whole self-awareness. And we talk about self-awareness, self-care and the support. So we talk about that a lot. So we need to think about that from an educator point of view. Sure, I can go into the data around the support that early childhood needs, but I don't think that's where we're sitting. I'm thinking it's about creating that from within.
And we've been thinking about well-being really ecologically, right? We've been thinking about kind of multi-dimensional ways of thinking about well-being. And I was thinking about the connection between well-being and things like professional status and autonomy. We know that when educators and teachers are really seen and really valued as professionals, that's a huge driver of well-being, right? And we can be advocates for that, and we can teach people, we can teach others to be advocates, and we can think about how we acknowledge and celebrate educators and teachers. One of the panel discussions yesterday was talking about, going beyond self-care, and we had the cupcake conversation. And, I'm not one to turn down a cupcake, but I think we can think about how do the ways that we acknowledge and celebrate educators communicate and elevate their professional status. I don't know if cupcakes do that, right? Or maybe cupcakes alone don't
Or as
do that.
Nicole mentioned yesterday, going bowling. Does that work?
Yeah, is it enough? Yeah,
Is
yeah.
it enough? How does it work? So it's all about that co-design around that well-being as well. Like, how do we work together to find out what supports all of us to feel that sense of belonging? I can tell you what makes me feel a sense of belonging, but unless we work together to figure that out for our learning community, we may not get there.
Yeah, and it's those benefits that are seen, from a health perspective, from an enjoyment perspective, from an academic outcomes perspective, etc., and from a professional development perspective. And when we can foster that sense of belonging, that we know the effort that we might place and the intentionality we might place into that is very worthwhile. So we've got a comment in the chat from Anna. So belonging and reciprocity, I can never say that word.
I'm not good at that word either.
Can that be hampered through someone's use of boundaries? Louis, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, well, it was so interesting to hear Dr. Rebecca talk about boundaries. And I wrote down something she said. She said, boundaries take away the guesswork. And it struck me that that's exactly the way early childhood educators think about limits and boundaries with children, which is that it's actually not about saying no. It's about creating the yes environment.
Definitely.
In which we don't need to be constantly policing what, children can't do or what we can't.
So if we can do that with
other.
children, can we do that as an educator team? Can we do that with our families?
Absolutely.
As I said, I would ask more questions than I would answer. Sorry, Geri.
You're all good. And I'm loving things coming through in the chat. We've got Julie saying, the key takeaway is the importance of those personal boundaries, and our personal thriving is not selfish, but it's important and necessary for us to be able to give our best. Jen, what do you think about this?
Yeah, I think that's really important. I think one of the challenges that I hear from educators is not knowing how to set those boundaries, not really being, sure, not wanting to say no to someone, wanting to respect them. And I think sometimes we're good at saying, no, I don't have time right now. We'll give you some more time later. We're less able to say, no, I don't have the emotional capacity right now. So being able to just get comfortable with those reframes of, I really respect what you're bringing to me and that you want to talk to me about this, or you need this support from me, whether that's to a parent or a colleague or a child. But I'm not the best person right now. I can come back to you a little later, or I can connect you with someone else who can help you right now. Which would you prefer? So you're giving the person voice and choice. You're showing respect for their issue and their need, but you're also respecting yourself and your capacity at this moment. Be that about how much time you have, or how much emotional capacity you have to be present with them, or your need to just get to the bathroom or get a cup of tea before you teach the next class. That self-care and remembering that you need to actually look after yourself to be able to support those people who need you.
And it's almost before the self-care, it's a self-awareness that there's a need for self-care.
Absolutely.
And we admit that we're not that good at that.
And I really liked in Rebecca's conversation as well today on boundaries, she talked about a mindful yes and a protective no. What did you think of that, Tina?
Yeah, I think it was, what I liked about it was almost, it aligned to a strength-based sort of approach to it. And I think that we can often find as individuals, it's hard to say no, like that grates a little bit for me personally. And so it grates because I need to do more of it, not because I don't agree with it. But I think that description of it feels like it gives me permission to try, rather than feel like I'm immediately walking into some sort of conflict situation. And I think, we'd been talking about understanding that our boundaries come from a whole lot of external resources as well. So the modelling that we've had growing up, or the experiences we've had when we've tried to implement boundaries, and again being that self-aware of, I might react this way because of this experience. And I think that that's helpful for us to think about too.
Yeah, definitely. It's really important. And somebody popped that in the chat saying around, you know, you often need to take a look inwards before you're sort of looking around you as well. So a really valuable point. There was also in relation to boundaries, you know, because we said today was all about sort of those practical tips, etc. There was Rebecca put forth a conversation around how we actually might present a conversation around boundaries. And she gave some strategies where, you know, it's all about how we frame those questions when we're going into discussing boundaries with others. And I think, again, Jen, coming back to what you just said, if it's not right for you at the time, then you need to be responding appropriately for yourself. But if you're talking to others, it's around how you present the information. And she used some key phrases of, I've noticed that, to start a conversation, or I'm wondering if, and that makes it then that collective, collaborative conversation. Yeah.
I think our conversation can empower boundary setting in another way as well. Like we can be coaching others to respect our boundaries by asking them about theirs. So when we're asking a colleague if they could pick up a piece of work for us, saying, do you think you have capacity? It's okay for you to say no. I'm asking if you can do it, but I will go and find someone else to help me if it's not you. If you're talking to a child about asking them to do a job, it's, you know, I would really like it if you would do this. Are you the right person to do it right now? If you're setting up spaces for students to say no, for families to say no, for your colleagues to say no, they're going to be much more likely to accept your no when you need to say a no as well.
Yeah, it's really important. Well, we're going to go on to sort of like a next point of conversation, and this was around thinking about what thriving looks like into the future and what approaches we can take to thrive in this changing environment. And I wanted to reflect on your presentation earlier on, Karin, around disaster resilience, and yeah, that's sort of not snapping back into the old but going into the new, and where your thoughts have got to.
And it was funny because that came up almost ad hoc within our panel discussion today. Listening to Geri talk about everything, the recovery, the resilience, and everything that they've been sharing and showing, they realised that what was before wasn't ever going to be again, but that didn't matter. Geri almost said that it's better now. And I think that new normal can be better if we work on it the way Geri and their learning community has, by looking at the positives and looking at, so I'll use their bush kinder as an example. They had a bush kinder that was actually devastated by the fires. And there was nothing left of that, but they used the opportunity to support resilience and for that recovery when they saw regrowth happening, and they could talk with the children through that. So the new normal for the bush kinder was watching it grow, for the children to use the charcoal from the fire as, you know, as almost art therapy. So
Fantastic.
I think it's, it gives you goosebumps when you think about how far, you know, in the 4 years, well, they're in their 4th year since the fires, how much that learning community has found their new normal and how beneficial that has been for the whole community. And Geri touched on that as well. It's not just their kindergarten, it's the whole community.
It's the whole community. And we know that, you know, sort of that family partnership and that community spirit is one thing that's a real driver, and is talked through our professional learning modules as well, the importance of that. So talking again around sort of trauma-informed practice, Jen, was there anything that you wanted to add in this space around how this helps us thrive in changing environments?
Sure. I think, you know, one of the things that was just mentioned was that the new resources that have come out of trauma. So out of all the different traumas that have impacted communities over the past few years, the pandemic having affected all of the world really, you know, there are new resources that we've developed. Many of us have developed new technology capabilities to connect with people further afield. Many of us have developed a bigger appreciation for our relationships and our points of connection. We've also developed, you know, a new societal conversation about, you know, how we relate as a community, what we're doing with our minority groups, and there's bigger conversations bubbling up in our media around these things than we've ever had before. I'm going to throw back over to you guys.
I love, Jen, you know, we were
Segue.
talking about this before, right? Like one of the great things about the education profession is that the issues are always changing and evolving. We were so lucky to have Esma and Nina from Narragansett join us yesterday. And it was so powerful to me that in that, that very first video they played, and just a couple of minutes into their session, they talked about the impacts of colonization and the impacts of racism. And I don't know that 10 years ago, if we were having this conference, we would have been talking about colonization or racism. I think the conversation is changing. I think we're moving beyond tolerance narratives. I think we're getting more comfortable with acknowledging and celebrating difference. We're talking about voice. We're starting to talk about things like sovereignty. These are national conversations. These are also conversations, in our services and in our schools. So I think it's so powerful that, to think about diversity and inclusion, well-being, these issues aren't, over here and over there. These are really connected.
Yeah, and it's how we embrace all of that and make it part of our sort of normal dialogue, isn't it? It's just the same as mental health is getting, that kind of status. And in, so from a mental health perspective as well, we're starting to talk about, okay, well, people now have got more of an understanding around what mental health and wellbeing looks like at all ends of our mental health continuum. And it's now, well, how do we then turn a conversation into some action? And what do we do about this to move from just that awareness now into action? And I think that's where the Reconciliation Australia conversation was going yesterday as well. We're all starting to take these actions, and a reconciliation action plan can be one of those actions.
And I think that for me, that was one of the lovely things in all of the sessions that I listened to or participated in. There was the practical strategies. Every session, there was some very practical strategies. And, if I think about the Indigenous session, for me, I thought, okay, what I can do now is I can actually, perhaps my action is to create an acknowledgement that is not your standard, acknowledgement that I've pulled off a website, that I actually personalise it in some way by saying, the land on which I'm on, the people are connected to the water, or, that type of thing. And even just thinking about Annette and Libby's session around neurodiverse and individuals and children with a disability. I mean, I'm a mother of a neurodiverse child, and they gave some really practical solutions about what you could do to help that particular group thrive. But in actual fact, a lot of those strategies help everybody, because you might be a visual learner without a disability. You might come from a cultural background that's not Indigenous, but that approach to the inclusiveness, belonging, makes us thrive.
I think we've heard a lot through the whole conference about meeting people where they are and helping them to grow from there. No cookie cutter approaches, but tailored support from educators to young people and children in their care, through to school leaders and early learning service leaders, meeting their staff where they are on their own personal wellbeing journey and helping them grow and flourish as well.
I love that analogy of the cookie cutter approach, because Louis and I were talking about this earlier. People want practical strategies. We admit that. Been an educator in early learning for a long, long time. I wanted those practical strategies as well. And then working in the disability sector as an educator for quite some time, people often wanted the magic wand approach, where you would be able to go in and give them all the strategies they need to fix. And I use fix because that was what was wanted. I guess what I've learnt and what I'm doing more and more of now is getting early childhood educators to own their own magic wand, because it's their place and space. It's your wand. How you wave it and what you do when you wave it is up to you, because we can't do cookie cutter, because what works for me may not work for you. What works in this service may not work in a remote service, for a whole range of reasons. So build your own wand.
I am definitely using that. I love that.
That's fabulous.
Fantastic.
I think, sometimes that magic wand at the end of that referral pathway gives people unrealistic expectations about what mental health clinicians can do for them. And when I hear that kind of talk with our educators that we work with, I try to shift the narrative to one around building the support network. Like, let's not think about a referral pathway with a magic wand at the end, but how do we build capacity of the support network for the individual? And that can be tapping in a mental health clinician, but it can also be looking at ways to build the capacity of the other people already in that support network, the parents and carers, the educators, and building their communication both ways between them. But I love that analogy of hold your own, the person at the center of that support network, wave the magic wand and let the support network know what you need from them, and you know,
Build the one
build.
together.
Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah.
I think
build
the
that
other
space.
thing we have to be conscious of, or perhaps it's only me that has this expectation, but you often think that you've got to implement something big to, you know, achieve, where in actual fact, small things can, you know, have significant outcomes. I mean, we have a family in our a saying in our family, how do you eat an elephant? And we say one piece at a time, you know, because it's too big. You can't even imagine how you could make a difference. And sometimes that could immobilize you as an individual, as a community, so I think we have to remember or remind ourselves the value of small things that can lead to bigger things.
Yeah, fantastic. And what are some of the small things that you've seen happen in learning communities that are the start of then a continued and ongoing journey?
I went along to one of our specialist school settings to one of their meetings just to be a guest speaker and share some BU resources with them. But what I noticed when I was observing the beginning of their meeting was that they had built into their practice a small habit of going like a round robin conversation of just checking in on each other on how they were feeling, what they'd learnt in the past week, and who they wanted to give a shout out to for who'd helped them that past week. And it was such a dynamic and uplifting dialogue that I brought that back to our team to put in at the beginning of our team meeting. So just little changes in habit, really, that shift the tone of the dialogue and the narrative in the space. Anyone else?
Yeah, I think maybe this isn't so little, but part of the work we do with Early Childhood Australia, I'm sorry,
Doesn't need to be
it
little.
doesn't need to be little. This is probably going to be quite big now, I'm thinking about it, but we have connected communities. And I'm part of one called Advocating for Children's Rights. So one of the little things that has become a big thing is about listening to the children and having their voices and having everyone's voices in what you do. So the children in a particular service, Claire, if you're watching, I'm calling you out, they write their own program. They sit with the educators and they talk about what they would like to do. And after they've done something, they talk about what next. So I could turn that around, and that could be about educators too. You know, we're doing this right now, but what's next?
Yeah, absolutely. And I really enjoyed this session with the school representative today, where she was describing exactly what she'd been doing with the school that she's obviously involved in the leadership of. And it was around, sitting with the team and thinking about what is going to resonate with you to make those small steps to start you on that journey and start to think about what your plan is, not just for today, but for the year. And it is all around, the collective, isn't it? And that whole learning community approach that will end up having the biggest collective impact.
Because it's the ripple effect too.
Yeah.
You know, you start with this and the ripple effect just leads to that mentally healthy community.
That's right. And so we're talking BU, and it fits very well into this conversation around getting that collective understanding through the use of data. So Louis, what have you seen happening within BU in relation to this, or what do you place importance on?
I mean, I love that we're talking about voice, right? And it's been such a theme in so many of the sessions, and such an important reminder, right? We don't actually need to guess what might drive well-being in our learning community, or what educators or children or families need, because we can ask them, right? And we can use things like surveys. But really, data is, the word data freaks us out a little bit, right? But data is just information. We can also learn by talking to people, having structured conversations. There are all sorts of ways we can kind of get in touch with what's happening in our learning community, and then really plugging that, you were talking about this before, Tina, into a really kind of planned and intentional process of change. You don't need to do it all tomorrow. We need to normalize probably that change takes time. It takes longer than we think. But we can plan for that. Yeah.
Go, Jen.
I'd love to pull the data right back and just start talking about when we're working with individual young people, teaching them to collect some data from themselves about where they are, you know, whether we're using a scale of red light to green light or 1 to 5. How are you feeling right now? What's telling you that? Let's trial a self-care strategy and then reassess where you are and see if that was effective or not. And then can we put that lens on what we do as educators for our own well-being? And then can we look at what the whole school's doing, use the BU surveys, sure, or do an inventory with our implementation and reflection tool of what we've got happening across the 5 domains, gather the data, take some action, look at the data again. You don't have to use the BU tools. There are other, you know, education systems have their own well-being surveys and things, and your BU consultant can help you to analyse that or to use the BU tools if you need to, because you don't have other ones. But yeah, let's start with the individual using some evidence-based practice for their own self-care.
And if you are collecting data, I think it's really important to acknowledge the why of collecting data and what's the data that we need to collect or want to collect, because we can collect all of the data, but if it doesn't make sense to our place and space and to what we want to learn and what we want to change maybe, or what we want to become our new normal, then it doesn't make sense. So I think about the implementation and reflection toolkit as well, but I like to break that down when I work with educators because it's massive. So where do we need to start? What domain, what statement actually makes sense for you right now? Let's work on that one and then move forward. Little things, right? Ripple effect.
I love that you make that point, Karin, because I think it's so hard to take action if you haven't defined the change that you want to see.
That's right.
Right?
Yeah.
And that's where those implementation tools become so helpful. The BU implementation cycle, we've got some new resources coming on, you know, online over the next few months. Really taking that time as a learning community to say, okay, where are we? Where do we want to be? Right? Where in that gap, you know, might we think about our kind of vision for change? Because that gives you the why, and you can rally people around a why.
And you can rally around the why. I love that. I think that's so important. Yeah.
And sometimes when we use those tools, like the implementation and reflection tool with schools, we discover that they're doing a whole lot in learning resilience. They've got lots of programs happening there, but almost too much. They're exerting all this energy, but they don't have a consistent language. And we, instead of telling them to do more, we're actually saying, tone back, do less. Just pick one program for the whole school. Let's get one set of language so that every teacher every year isn't trying to teach a whole new set of social and emotional learning language. And when we look at the survey data, sometimes that can be overwhelming, right? Because there's just so much data there. But we really work on, you know, let's try and just look at 3 things that you could celebrate. 3 things that could be some quick wins that you might just make a small change, like communicate with the parents what you're doing so that then they understand, or you know, just little things that you can do for quick wins, and then maybe 2 or 3 things for longer term change. You don't have to respond to every piece of the data. You look at it and think, what are we doing well? What can we do that's manageable and sustainable to move forward?
Quick wins empower us, don't they? I think we need the quick win to go, all right, we've made that, we did that. So now what's my short-term goal leading to our longer-term goal? But we need the quick wins in order to keep going.
And we need the points of celebration.
For sure.
And I think one of the beautiful things about BU is that there's so many resources that are available that you can use them in different ways at different times. So, for example, the principal from St Francis was talking about how she'd started the journey with the wellbeing plan, where other people would start the journey with the survey. Other people would start it through some other, you know, thing. But it's about, I suppose, there's lots of resources and lots of ways to get your data, your evidence, all of those types of things, and that you know your community's best, and you would be able to make the judgment about what would work well for you at that particular time, at that particular moment.
And, you know, we've got that framework of the whole learning community, right? And I think BU is really useful for thinking about how we think about that change kind of at every level of the learning community. I think it's always so exciting when we see services and schools taking a look at their policies with
Yeah.
a well-being lens, right? I
Mm.
think it's a bit hard to find a silver lining from COVID, but I think something we've kind of come out of that experience with is well-being has a little bit more gravity to it now, right? I think we're able to look at things like our email policies, our policies around documentation, assessment, marking, communications. And, we can really think about educator well-being as a consideration that we need to balance when we're putting those together.
And one of the services I support in this connected community that I've already spruiked once and I'll continue to do, they have developed their wellbeing policy, but their wellbeing policy has been written from their practice, not the other way around.
Yeah.
Mm.
So
Right.
practices inform policy, and I just go, wow, that's like just
Mhm.
a light bulb moment. Who would have thunk that?
That's the true reason for policy, isn't
It
it? To
is.
make sure good things continue to happen and aren't lost when new staff come on board. It's not to impose someone, or not just to write it for no good,
Yeah.
just to have one. It's to say this good stuff is happening. Let's document it so we can continue it.
And Jen, Lee's just put in the chat, what are we doing well is a great beginning,
Yes.
right?
Yeah.
And that's exactly it. It's about saying, what are we doing well? How do we make sure everyone knows about it,
That's it.
right?
Yeah.
How do we kind of get it
Yeah.
living, beyond the confines maybe of one room or one
Yeah.
part of our community?
And one of the things I've noticed coming up in the surveys with schools a lot is that the educators and the students are saying things are going well, and the parents are saying, oh, no, my child wouldn't know how to get support. Oh, no, my child doesn't know this. So the problem there is obviously the communication. It's such easy, quick win to look at how do we communicate the great things we're doing with our wider
Mhm.
community, with our parents and carers, and celebrate this stuff together.
And we don't take time to celebrate.
We don't.
Right? We're
task
on to the
focused.
next
Do,
thing.
do, do.
Yeah.
And self-critical.
Yes.
I think the other thing too, for anyone who participated in the leadership session, talking about systemic leadership and that leadership, which, rang bells for me. I've always had a view that leadership is not about hierarchy. Leadership is about us all as individuals. We all have a leadership role and responsibility. But it was clear in that session that the BU initiative actually very much supports a systemic leadership approach. And again, I think that framework, for want of a better word, allows you to sort of think about well-being. Our BU framework allows us to think about well-being in a systemic way, but also cover the things that we need to think about, not just forget the voice of the child or not forget communication with parents or not, that type of thing.
I think that's really important as well. And it's just made me think about something that we discussed at the BU's got a National Advisory Council with some incredible experts in, education and mental health sitting on there. And one of the things they were talking about recently was the power of the voice and also sort of the agency of the children and young people in terms of talking to, where they want to go with things. One of the things it's made me think of is there was a comment around, when the student voice is being listened to now, the students are also saying that they want their educators to be well and healthy and in a position to be able to support them well. And I think that's really powerful when it's coming, the educators want to support the children, but the children are saying, we also want to make sure our educators are supported, and that student voice is really starting to shine through.
Well, that's the reciprocity. Right?
Yeah,
That's the
yeah.
giving and
Yeah, and you
Say
can
that
say the
word
word
so
and I can't. Yeah, fantastic. So I think that the agency piece is something that is a really important factor in that moving forwards, keeping us focused on what we actually need, because context is king, and we need to make sure we're thinking about our individual contexts. We're having some lovely comments coming through in the chat. A lot of people talking about filling your own tank first, being self-aware, thinking about setting those healthy boundaries, enjoying sort of the conversations around resilience, boundaries, well-being, etc., and how important they all are. We're going to quickly go into a last sort of topic area, which is around how can we support our learning communities towards building well-being, resilience, and inclusion. So anybody got any sort of final words?
Build your wand. I said it. You have to build your wand.
I've now got one.
I think one of the things that came through for me over the 2 days was we had people sort of showcasing, I suppose, the BU resources, whether they be fact sheets or consultant or whatever it is. But we also had people saying, we've used these resources and these resources actually are good and have made a difference. So, I think what it's a reminder that we actually already have a whole pile of stuff in our toolbox to access immediately without thinking of something new or different. So yes, it makes me think I need to go back to the BU website and have another look at it about what I could use.
I'd also like to add there that, yes, the BU website has fantastic stuff, never going to dispute that. But we talked earlier about reconciliation action plans and a Reconciled Australia and all of those things as well. So BU doesn't have to sit as a separate piece of work. Your RAP doesn't have to sit as a separate piece of work. Your QUIP for quality improvement plans and early learning does not have to sit as a separate piece of work. Bringing them all in together so that your reconciliation action plan informs your quality improvement plan, informs your mental health and wellbeing focus. I think that's a strategy that we can work towards.
Yeah, I think seeing BU as a framework that works really well with all the other things that are going on, like trauma-informed practice, Berry Street, Australian Childhood Foundation have great resources on trauma-informed practice, and that sits really well complementarily with BU. We want to streamline things for learning services, but I would say this thriving piece, relatedness, building those relationships, building little changes in habit, in routine, opening up and continuing that conversation that we've started around emotional regulation, social and emotional learning, and respect, that agency, voice and choice. They're my 4 key takeaways from the last couple of days.
Yeah, fantastic. And I think we're at with time now. I just want to call out a message from Liana that's come through. And she's saying that what she's going to take away from this conference is learning how to be a strong advocate for herself, just as she is for the families, children and colleagues. And I think that's a really lovely point in there. So having heard your top tips, Jen, does anybody else want to give their sort of top tips or reflections in our last few minutes together?
I'm having such fun
Yeah,
reading
me too.
these comments which are right in front of me. I think a real theme is this idea, and this is another reframing, right, Jen, that educator well-being is not selfish. We know that educators don't always put themselves first. We know something about the occupational hazards of being an educator. There's a high degree of emotional labor. There's the risk of burnout in early childhood spaces. It's really physical work, right? So making sure we have what we need, making sure that our colleagues have what they need, is how we do best by children. The other thing, because the other theme that's really coming through in the comments that I see is to do with boundaries. And I love that you talked about modeling boundaries for children. I think this is something that a lot of educators are really good at, thinking about children's boundaries and children's ability to consent. And we can do really simple things like tell the child what we're about to do before we do it, right? I'm about to touch your arm so I can help you pull your jumper over your head, whatever it is, right? And you made this point too, Tina, this is how we learn to set healthy boundaries and get out of that kind of uncomfortable space, saying what we're comfortable with. Yeah.
It's interesting because for me, if I think about the things I'm taking away, there's a lot, too many to describe. But if I flip that, what I found interesting was some of the data that was quoted today around, for example, people's sense of belonging, but also the OECD data. There was Australian research on 5,000 teachers, I think it was. And it was all saying that this was still really important, but what was thought-provoking about it was, have we actually moved very far? Because some of this data was 2021, I think. So I suppose for me, it's like, there is lots out there. What can I do to move it forward, because on one level, there's some data that's suggesting that it's still a challenge.
Mm.
And so I think that's interesting to think about that in our own context. Is it a challenge in our learning community, or have we moved on, and can we then share that in some way?
Yeah, and I totally agree. I think what's important to acknowledge is that is still a challenge. And so that's one of my takeaways. I think we've learnt a lot about what we can do to support our well-being, but what I think is really important to acknowledge as well is that it's okay not to be okay. We don't always have to be resilient. Life is hard. Our work is hard. Being in the sector is hard, and it's okay to acknowledge that. So yesterday there was a talk about making sure to not run on an empty tank, but sometimes you have to acknowledge that your tank is empty and I don't quite know how to fill it up right now. And what do I need to fill it up? I actually don't have the answer to that, and that's okay. But if you're in a supportive environment where your mental health literacy is there and you can have those conversations, someone may be able to fill your tank up just a little bit to keep you going. So
that's right. It's a really good point. So it's and again, it's, you know, we've got that connectedness, and we're looking out for that whole learning community, so we're all aware of what's happening for us. We can start to shift those dials and make people comfortable to have that conversation, which I think is fabulous. So I'm going to do just a few prompts at the end of this session. Again, sort of like, thank you so much for everything that you've contributed through all of your comments and your participation over the 2 days. We'd really love you to join up as a whole learning community, connect with your BU consultant. I think, you know, we've got Jen and Karin here. These are the kinds of fabulous people you can meet when you connect with your consultants. They really are a differentiating factor for BU, and they're something that as an initiative, we are super proud of you all. You really do make a difference in the learning communities, and that's been reflected through what's been said back through the chat. You are the ones that deliver those implementation sessions. So join our conversation. We'll be extending the conversation from the conference through our implementation sessions and events, whether that's through a conversation, a connected community, whether it's through one of our webinars. So please keep your juices flowing, keep the conversations flowing, and maintain your connection with us. And obviously we've got the website and all of these tools that we've said will help you with those practical strategies that you can translate into your work with the children and young people. We'd love you to keep in touch with us. We've got our socials that you can see on here. We've also got a new Insta social channel. We'd love you to sort of start following us, start to get your information about BU sort of fed through to you. We've got a fabulous campaign out there at the minute all about making sure that more people are aware of what BU can offer. Including around our educator wellbeing, and the fact that we want educators to raise your hands, ask the questions you need to know, because BU is here to support you. So please use us to your best advantage. There's so much expertise and lovingness coming in your direction from the BU team, and we'd love you to keep connected with us so that we can help support you and your learning communities. Before we go, I'd like to send out some very big thank yous. So to this wonderful panel, I'd like to thank you all for all of your participation and support. I'd also like to thank the entire team behind the scenes, and I think across the workforce from Beyond Blue, Early Childhood Australia, Headspace. We're here working with Clifton's in our venues. This has been an absolutely fantastic effort, building resources, building awareness, raising literacy around BU and all we offer, and giving people that professional development that helps them to support the children and young people, which is that dial that we really want to shift. So thank you to everybody that's been participating, and a particular specific thanks to our virtual conference working group. That is a bunch of team across our 3 organisations, our One BU approach in relation to how we go about developing our sessions, and that team have been absolute superstars. They've been picking up on a catchphrase we've got around keep it simple superstars. They've done that, they've delivered, and they've done an absolutely fantastic job. So big thank you to you all. And that's it. So enjoy the rest of your evening. Keep in touch with us. We are here for you, and go well about your learning communities, and take care of yourselves. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.